Chapter 1: The Call for Independence, the Origin of a Proud Nation. On September 2, 1945, at the historic Ba Ding Square, President Ho Chi Minh read the Declaration of Independence, giving birth to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. That moment was not only a brilliant milestone in Vietnamese history, but also a resounding echo throughout the world about the aspiration for freedom, the right to live, and the right to national independence. 80 years later, when looking back, Vietnamese people and international friends can affirm that it was an event that not only shaped the destiny of the Vietnamese nation, but also contributed to changing the course of the national liberation movement on a global scale. If we imagine history as a blockbuster movie, then September 2, 1945 is the emotional climax. After nearly a century of living in slavery under colonial rule, the Vietnamese people rose up and regained the right to control their own destiny. And the moment President Ho Chi Minh solemnly declared, Vietnam has the right to enjoy freedom and independence, and in fact has become a free and independent country, was like a gun firing the first shot of a new era. The era of people being masters, of the nation deciding its own path of development. So what made Vietnam's National Day event a source of global inspiration? First, it was the historical context. The world at that time had just emerged from World War II, a fierce war that killed hundreds of millions of people and caused heavy destruction. On a global scale, fascism was defeated, but the ghost of old colonialism still loomed over many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Colonized peoples yearned for independence, but not everyone had the conditions and courage to stand up and regain self-determination. In that context, the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was like a bolt of lightning tearing through the dark sky. It proved that even a small nation, poor in economy and weapons, could still stand up to defeat colonialism and fascism to assert itself. It was a huge spiritual boost, igniting the flames of struggle all over the world. It was no coincidence that in just a few decades, a series of countries in Asia and Africa regained their independence one after another. In other words, Vietnam's National Day was the pioneering torch of the national liberation movement. To see more clearly, let's try to open the defense map of the world in 1945. Asia at that time was still full of colonies. India under British rule, Indonesia under the Netherlands, the Philippines had just been regained from Japan but was still dependent on the US, while many African countries were still deeply under the colonial rule of France, Belgium, and Portugal. In the middle of that map, Vietnam suddenly stood out as a red, bright spot, declaring independence and confidently entering the international political arena. One can imagine that the oppressed peoples in Africa at that time were looking at Vietnam and exclaiming, "If Vietnam can do it, why can't we?" Of course, to have September 2, 1945, the Vietnamese people had to pay the price in blood, sweat, and tears for nearly a century of resistance against colonialism. That price was too high, but also too worthy. It not only brought freedom to the nation, but also gave the world a lesson. Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. This slogan later became a motto for life, a flag of solidarity for many other national liberation movements. Interestingly, if viewed from a slightly humorous perspective, Vietnam's National Day can be likened to an internet phenomenon of the 20th century. At that time, there was no internet, no YouTube or Facebook, but the news of a small nation in Indochina regaining independence spread around the world as quickly as a million-view video today. From Paris to New Delhi, from Jakarta to Cairo, the press, the workers' movement, and the intellectuals were all talking, "Vietnam has stood up, what about us?" It can be said that Vietnam's National Day sparked a global trend of the 20th century, the trend of demanding independence, the trend of eliminating colonialism. The second significance of this event lies in the fact that it not only changed the fate of a nation, but also contributed to shaking the colonial system around the world. If there had not been the September 2 event, perhaps France would have easily continued to rule Indochina and prolonged the colonial yoke for several more decades. But when Vietnam declared independence, the door to return was closed. Although France later recklessly returned, launching a new war of aggression, the vehicle of history had already started, and nothing could stop it. The birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam also created a chain effect on international politics. It forced the major powers to reconsider the world geopolitical map. The United States, the Soviet Union, and China were all interested in Vietnam because they understood that this was not just the story of a country, but the key to the struggle between colonialism and the national liberation movement. In other words, Vietnam's National Day placed the country on the world chessboard. And since then, Vietnam has become the center of many historical changes throughout the second half of the 20th century. But perhaps the most profound value of National Day still lies in its humanitarian spirit. The Declaration of Independence that President Ho Chi Minh read to his compatriots is not simply a political document, it is also a declaration of human rights, the right to life, and the right to self-determination. Ho Chi Minh quoted the American Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the French Declaration of Human Rights in 1791, but not to borrow, but to affirm that those rights do not belong to any individual, but to all of humanity. That makes Vietnam's National Day not only a source of pride for the Vietnamese people, but also a source of respect for progressive humanity. If we imagine history as a thick book, then the page of September 2, 1945 is one of the brightest pages, not only for Vietnam, but for the whole world. 80 years have passed, but the echoes of that history still resonate, still inspiring peoples who continue their journey in search of freedom and justice.
Chapter 2: Vietnam. From the war to defend the fatherland to lessons for humanity. When mentioning Vietnam, the world often immediately remembers a nation that has gone through thousands of years of fighting foreign invaders. From the time of fighting the Yuan-Mongol army to the resistance war against French colonialism, culminating in the war against American imperialism, Vietnam has demonstrated to all of humanity the strength of a small but never subdued nation. And it is this journey that has created a special legacy, making National Day September 2 not only Vietnam's Independence Day, but also a symbol of the spirit of fighting for independence and freedom of the whole world. During the war, Vietnam not only fought for its own territory, but also fought for a truth. All nations have the right to live freely, equally, and happily. The 1945 Declaration of Independence affirmed, all peoples in the world are born equal. Every people has the right to live, to be happy, and to be free. That is not only the declaration of a nation, but also the voice of human conscience. Many international scholars, when analyzing the history of Vietnam, have pointed out that there are few nations that have had to face the world's leading military powers and endure fierce embargoes, but still stand firm. The story of Vietnam is a vivid testament to the will of oppressed peoples. If looking at the world military map, Vietnam during the war was no different from a hotspot where superpowers wanted to impose their power. However, despite the bombs and bullets, Vietnamese villages still revived. The legendary Trường Son roads still opened, and the food and ammunition baskets continued to nourish the front line. Vietnam can be imagined as a small bee, but when invaded by the enemy, that bee can make a giant bear suffer. The US brought to Vietnam the most modern weapons of the time: B-52 aircraft, Agent Orange, aircraft carrier fleet, but in the end, everyone had to retreat. The world called it the victory of those who have nothing but faith, while the Vietnamese simply considered it a way of life. Rather sacrifice everything than lose the country. After the war ended, the image of Vietnam continued to become a source of inspiration for many third world countries. From faraway Africa, national liberation movements found in Vietnam a torch to light the way. In Latin America, the story of Vietnam became a study material for many revolutionary movements. In other words, Vietnam exported, not weapons, but the spirit of autonomy and independence. However, the victory is not only limited to the military aspect. The good thing about Vietnam is that after gaining independence, the country did not fall into a spiral of hatred. Vietnam knows how to reconcile, knows how to close the past, to move toward the future. The handshake between people who used to be on both sides of the battle line is proof of a peace-loving nation. This makes Vietnam's National Day not only a day to celebrate victory, but also a day for the whole world to learn lessons about humanity and harmony. Chapter 3: Vietnam Today, a global inspiration in the new era. If 80 years ago, National Day on September 2 opened a new era for the Vietnamese people, today that National Day has gone beyond the scope of a nation to become a symbol of global stature. The world looks at Vietnam not only with admiration for the past, but also with surprise at the strong progress in the present. On the world economic map, Vietnam has transformed itself from a poor, war-torn country into one of the most dynamic economies in the region. Stable GDP growth, participation in a series of international trade agreements, and an increasingly important role in global organizations show that Vietnam is no longer a victim of history, but has become an important player on the world stage. What is special is that Vietnam builds its strength not based on force, but on culture, solidarity, and sustainable development. The image of the conical hat, the ao dai, and traditional dishes have become soft but strong symbols, helping Vietnam make its mark on the international cultural map. In international forums, Vietnam is often mentioned as a typical country in peacekeeping and participating in the United Nations peacekeeping force. That proves that from a country that was once devastated by war, Vietnam has risen to contribute to protecting world peace. It is impossible not to mention the human factor. The Vietnamese people, with their industrious, creative, and optimistic nature, have surprised international friends many times. When a global pandemic occurred, Vietnam was considered one of the countries that responded quickly and effectively. When facing an economic crisis, Vietnam still maintained remarkable stability. It is the spirit of not giving up that has created a soft power that spreads throughout the world. If we look deeper, the 80th anniversary of National Day is not only the story of a nation, but also the story of a lesson for humanity. Any nation, no matter how small, can assert its position if it persistently pursues the path of independence and peace. Vietnam has proven that. And that is why today's Vietnam National Day is not only a holiday for the Vietnamese people, but also a spiritual holiday for all those who love freedom and justice. At the end of the article, perhaps we need to emphasize that from history to the present, from war to peace, from poverty to development, Vietnam has gone through a difficult but also glorious journey. The 80th anniversary of National Day not only marks a milestone for a nation, but also sends a strong message, the aspiration for independence, freedom, and happiness can always come true if a nation knows how to unite, sacrifice, and love peace. And if you, the viewers of History and War channel, are following this story, remember that history is not only for fun, but also for learning, for drawing lessons for the present and the future. Let's continue to spread inspiring stories like this by clicking like, share, and subscribe so that we can continue to write the journey of discovering history and World War through a new, vivid, and humane lens.